Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening, friends, and welcome back to Scary Stories Told in the Dark. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and tonight we're opening the door to things better left outside. Mysterious packages, invisible borders, flickering transmissions from beyond, delivered not by mistake but by design. Joining me again with a voice sharp enough to slice static and a grin full of thunder is my co-host, Malcolm Blackwood.
Thanks, Otis. I've always believed you can tell a lot about a place by what it receives after dark. A crate left with no cinder. A town that wasn't there yesterday. A transmission that wasn't meant for us. It's like the night has its own kind of mail. And tonight, it's all marked, Return to Cinder.
So, dust off the welcome mat. Or better yet, bolt the door. Because these stories don't knock, they walk in. Before we tug on the first thread of this haunted package, just a reminder. If you prefer your horror ad-free and uncensored, consider joining us in the patrons area.
For just $7.99 a month, or less if you commit to the shadows for a full year, you'll get early access to new episodes, exclusive bonus content, and a front row seat to the weirdest corners of the dark.
Head over to simplyscarypodcast.com and click on Patrons. That'll take you to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where the nightmares never stop and the static always hums.
Fuel the fire, feed the darkness, and most of all, keep the stories coming.
Now then, let's take our first step across the wire and see who's waiting on the other side. Our first tale tonight traces a line between legacy and lunacy. A tightrope act passed down through blood, one that crosses not just space but sanity. When Mateo returns to the Andes to walk the path his father once did, he finds the wire is more than just steel. It's a doorway. This is The Wire Between Worlds by Alessandro Viscari, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. The house that Mateo Morales rented sat alone at the edge of a rust-colored bluff where wind-carved ridges into the earth and telephone poles leaned slightly eastward, as though drawn toward some invisible point past the horizon. He'd chosen it for its silence, but also because it was far enough from anything that no one could come looking unless they already knew what to ask for. That privacy had become necessity. Inside, the air smelled faintly of chalk dust and old sweat, the relics of a time he no longer acknowledged except in dreams. A coil of rope sat atop a wooden crate by the window, untouched for over a year. The balancing pole leaned against the wall nearby, gathering dust where the grips had once blistered his palms raw. He had not stood on a wire since the fall. The mornings came cold in the desert, and the sun, through the slatted blinds, did little to warm the room. Mateo stood in the kitchen, nursing the same mug of black coffee he'd refilled twice without sipping. A news radio station murmured low in the background, but the words failed to form meaning. His attention lingered instead on the manila envelope sitting on the counter, unmarked except for a waxed seal pressed with a symbol he did not recognize. The thin, vertical line crossed at intervals like a ladder set aflame. He'd found it the day before, left on the porch without a knock. No courier, no signature, no tracks in the dirt. Now, with reluctance, more instinct than decision, he cracked the seal and unfolded the heavy parchment within. Mr. Miller-Alice, the time has come to return what was never finished. The wire remains. You are summoned to complete what others abandoned. The towers are prepared. The wind is watching. There was no contact number, no signature, only a set of coordinates, and beneath them a line rendered in italicized script. Cross where others turned back. For a long moment, Mateo stared at the page, as if it might alter its meaning the longer he observed it. Then, setting it down with care, he crossed to the bedroom and opened the small, fireproof box beneath his bed. The photograph inside was folded at the corners, worn along the creases. It showed a younger Mateo, barely 20, standing between his father and grandfather. All three wore performance silks and harnesses. In the background, a wire stretched between two scaffolds set over a darkened stadium crowd, scarcely visible beneath the stage lights. Augustine Varelli had died during a canyon walk in 1975. Mateo's father, Emilio, had died performing a tribute to that final crossing in 2004. Mateo had nearly joined them, a slip saved by a frayed safety tether that left him with a shattered hip, a fused ankle, and a ruined career. And still, the wire had found its way back to him. His phone buzzed once on the kitchen table, jolting him back into motion. The name on the screen froze him. Veronica Morales. He let it ring once more before answering. I'm guessing you know why you're calling. Her voice came through, sharp and tired. I saw the article in the San Diego paper. Someone's staging a walk. They're calling it ceremonial. You haven't, Mateo. Tell me you haven't already agreed. I just got the letter. You're not going, right? He turned from the window as if that might grant him the clarity to lie. I haven't decided. There was silence on the line. Then, softer. You remember the last time you were called to do something like this? That was different. No, she said, it wasn't. It was dressed up differently, that's all. They always are. Different sponsors, different justifications, but the wire stays the same. He said nothing. His gaze drifted again to the invitation. To his chagrin, the phrase, "the wind is watching," had embedded itself in his mind. Still have the articles, Veronica continued. Old blueprints from your grandfather's walk. You know how it ended, but no one talks about how it started. You got an offer like this, too. Same kind of phrasing, same kind of nowhere. Mateo let his eyes drift shut. The coffee had gone cold in his hand. I think I need to finish it. You don't need to finish anything. You're not responsible for what they didn't walk. But maybe I am, he said. Her voice shifted into something lower, pleading. If you go, please promise me something. He waited. If anything feels wrong, she continued, feels wrong, not looks wrong. You turn around. I'll keep that in mind, he said, but neither of them believed it. He flew out the next morning with a single bag and no return itinerary. The ticket had already been paid for. A man in an airport uniform handed it to him wordlessly after passport control. The flight took him south along the spine of the Andes. At one point, the clouds outside the window thinned, revealing what he believed for a moment to be a thread stretched impossibly high above a distant ravine, too thin to be real, but unnaturally straight. When he blinked, it was gone. There were no other passengers. When they landed at a military airstrip near the Chilean-Argentine border, the sky had begun to darken. The pilot did not speak as Mateo disembarked. Another man waited by a waiting jeep, dressed in black with no insignia. He nodded to Mateo, opened the passenger door, and drove without a word. The road turned to gravel, then to dirt. Hours passed in silence, the terrain flattening into a red plain surrounded by peaks of color of rust and ash. Distant dust devils spiraled in slow columns. Twice they passed herds of vicuñas standing stock still as though posed. Finally, they crested a hill, and Mateo saw them. Two towers, black as obsidian, rising from the center of a canyon choked with shadow. Between them, barely visible in the fading light, stretched a thread of silver. It didn't sag or tremble. It shimmered faintly, as though resisting the world around it. The driver pulled to a stop. Mateo opened the door and stepped into the cold wind, the smell of iron rising from the dust. The invitation had not mentioned a name. No plaque marked the towers. There was no scaffolding and no nets. There was only the line, suspended in the void, waiting. He didn't smile or pray. Instead, he reached into his bag and withdrew the gloves and took his first step toward the wire. Part 2. The helicopter came for him at dawn. It was already waiting on the ledge above the canyon when he emerged from the bunkhouse, its rotors ticking in place as if it had been there all night. Pilot didn't introduce himself. He simply gestured toward the open door, and Mateo climbed in without comment, ducking low beneath the spinning blades. The flight only took minutes, yet the air changed as they descended into the basin, dry heat giving way to something thinner and older, as though the wind had scraped across too many forgotten things on its way there. The towers came into view again, larger now and stranger in proportion. From a distance, they seemed constructed, artifacts of steel and purpose, but up close their surfaces betrayed no seams, bolts, or welds. Each rose from the red bedrock like a single solid extrusion, the color of wet volcanic glass. No ladders, no stairs, no maintenance lines. Just vertical smoothness, vanishing into the morning sky, impossible to scale without aid and anchored in no visible foundation. Between them stretched the wire. Mateo scrutinized it through the open side window, eyes narrowing. Its shimmer bent the lines around it. He could see the canyon floor on the other side, but only as if glimpsed through agitated water. The wire was too long for its diameter, too thin to maintain that tension unaided. And yet, it hung perfectly taut, unmoving in the wind that buffeted the helicopter's frame. When they touched down on the platform carved into the south ridge, a figure awaited him. Tall, suited in pale gray, holding a clipboard with nothing on it. The man's face was forgettable in the most literal way. Even as Mateo studied it, the features refused to cohere. It was a mouth and perhaps a mustache, a thin outline of cheekbones, but everything else blurred the longer he looked. "Welcome," said the man in a tone that carried no accent, as though it had been scrubbed clean. Mateo stepped out, shoulders hunched against the wind. "Are you with the Foundation?" The man's smile stretched, but did not rise to his eyes. "The wire remembers you." Mateo froze. "I didn't say that out loud," he muttered. "No," the man agreed. "You didn't." The man turned and walked toward the nearest tower, where a narrow outbuilding had been built into the rock face. It looked like a converted storage shed. Aluminum siding, a power unit humming inside it, a cluster of empty folding chairs stacked under a tarp. As they approached, a second figure emerged from behind the generator, wiping grease from his hands. This one wore coveralls stained at his knees and carried the unmistakable posture of a man waiting to be dismissed. He said nothing, nodding at Mateo. The gesture was slow, almost uncertain. Mateo glanced at the generator. Someone had spray-painted a line of graffiti in crude black strokes across the metal casing. The words were in Spanish, and though weathered by sand and sun, they remained legible. "El que cruza dos veces no regresa igual." Mateo translated silently. "He who crosses twice does not return the same." Inside the shed, I handed him a keycard, a printed schedule, and a clipboard with a liability waiver already signed. None of the staff spoke more than a sentence or two at a time. Their eyes were silent but distant, and once or twice, Mateo thought they were looking slightly to the left of him, as though tracking someone beside him instead. One man handed him a water bottle and whispered something under his breath, too quiet to catch, but repeated in the same rhythm a few moments later by another worker across the camp. At first, Mateo assumed it was coincidence. Then it happened again. An echo of a phrase he hadn't spoken aloud but had only thought in passing. "The wire can't be supported at this length." Minutes later, a woman in a jumpsuit muttered the exact words while passing behind him. He turned, but she kept walking. The training area had been demarcated with orange tape and weighted cones. An insultingly small strip of wire stretched between two steel supports, just 3 meters above the canyon floor. Mateo stood beneath it, arms crossed, watching it vibrate in the breeze. It wasn't remotely similar to the main wire. This one obeyed gravity and tension, behaved as expected, and gave no shimmer to the air around it. He climbed up once, tested his balance, then descended without a word. For the next few days, time unraveled in threads too loose to measure. The sun seemed to rise too fast and fall too slowly. Meals arrived at inconsistent intervals. His watch would skip ahead, then return to the hour he thought had passed. He began writing timestamps in a notebook, only to discover later that half the pages had already been filled with shaky versions of his own handwriting, recording entries he didn't remember making. Each night, the wind picked up and pushed hard against the towers. The sound that came through the canyon was not a howl, but something subtler. Mateo would lie in the bunk and listen, eyes open, trying not to hear the footfalls he swore sometimes accompanied it. The dreams came in the third night. He stood on the wire, not the training wire, but the true one, a span that stretched over the canyon. Below him, the world rotated, and above him, stars blinked and scattered. He stepped forward, and with each step, the tension in the wire reversed direction, as though he walked not across it, but beneath it. Then he saw the figure, upside down, walking the underside of the wire with perfect balance, its arms outstretched in a mirror of his own. Its face was hidden by the dark, but its feet made no contact with the wire. They hovered a few inches above, yet it advanced all the same. Matteo awoke before it reached him. By the 5th day, he no longer trusted the mirrors in the washroom. His reflection lagged slightly when he moved, adjusting with a faint blur, then catching up as if it embarrassed. He stopped shaving. When he tried to photograph the wire at sunset, the image came back inverted. The towers bent inward, the wire curving in ways the lens should not have captured. The photo erased itself minutes later. He stopped sleeping with the light off. On the 7th day, he stepped out near twilight and turned toward the far side of the canyon, hoping to clear his thoughts before rehearsal. The wind was low, the sun just beginning to slide behind the mountains, casting a wash of amber over the ridgeline. And then he saw it, not in the air or on the wire, but in the rock face opposite. The sun's position had painted a faint mirror of the entire camp onto the canyon wall, distorted and faint but visible. He could make out the outline of the south tower, the antenna dish, even the fold-out bunkhouse where he'd been sleeping. And across that reflection, blurred by heat and distance, a figure walked the wire. It moved slowly, knees bending ever so slightly with each motion. It raised its arms and tilted its head, all with perfect form. Matteo blinked hard and looked at the actual wire. It was empty, and yet the reflection still moved. Part 3. The knock came just after midday, a soft triple tap against the aluminum siding of the bunkhouse. Matteo had been resting in the corner near the cracked portable fan, not sleeping, but not fully alert either. He blinked, sat up slowly, stared at the door. It came again, more insistent this time. He opened it. Veronica stood framed in the harsh light, one hand gripping the strap of her duffel, the other shielding her eyes. Her hair was tied back in a loose braid, and her clothes bore the creased look of someone who had slept in a car, or perhaps not slept at all. Beneath her, the generator sputtered to life, then immediately cut out again, stalling with a cough of smoke. "Told you not to come," Matteo said. "I told you the same," she answered. "Here we are." He stepped aside and let her in. The room was small, barely large enough for the cot and the folding table that served as a desk. The chalkboard had been mounted against one wall, covered in notes and sketches Matteo had half erased in frustration. The air inside smelled faintly of copper and dust. Veronica set down her bag and turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room before settling on the window, the one that looked out across the ravine. In the distance, the wire glinted faintly. "They rebuilt it," she said, almost to herself. "Down to the last angle. Even the light fall's the same." "You've seen this setup before?" Matteo asked. "Not like this, but close enough. My uncle worked at a Chilean observatory back in the 80s. He used to bring me old aerial photos from government archives, stuff never meant for public eyes. One of them showed a nearly identical pair of towers outside Tacna. Same proportions, same wire. There was no mention of why they'd been built, only a code name and a series of blacked-out lines. When I asked him about it, he told me to burn the photo." Matteo raised an eyebrow. "Did you?" "I hid it under a floorboard in my grandmother's house." She paused. "It disappeared anyway." He said nothing. Outside, the wind pushed dust in uneven spirals against the window pane. "There's more," she said. "My grandmother, on my mother's side, used to tell stories about a sect of performers called the Los Quedos del Viento. It translates loosely to those fallen from the wind. She said they were acrobats, tightrope artists, high walkers, but also something more. They weren't entertainers, not exactly. They were channels, ritualists. Every walk was part of something larger. Matteo turned away from the window and sat on the edge of the cot. You think this is a ritual? I think it's always been one. She retrieved a tablet from her bag, powered it on, and handed it to him. The screen displayed a scanned copy of an old map, faded parchment, inked in a mix of Spanish and what appeared to be Quechua. The illustration depicted a range of Andean peaks connected by intersecting lines and spirals, most of which converged near the central canyon. There are ceremonial pathways carved into the ground in this region, Veronica explained. They look like nothing more than walking paths at first glance, but their geometry is precise, constructed according to star patterns. My grandmother said they used to walk these routes during eclipses or when the constellations aligned in certain ways. Some say they're trying to speak with the gods. Others think they were guarding against something from beyond. Matteo studied the map, then glanced toward the bunkhouse chalkboard. He stood, retrieved a ruler and compass, and began connecting points in the wire rig's layout he'd previously sketched. It wasn't precise, just a quick attempt at orientation, but the pattern that emerged sent a cold tremor through his chest. The towers formed one side of an incomplete geometric diagram, a sigil or mandala of sorts, mirroring ceremonial burial maps he'd once seen in a museum display on Incan necropoli. When he added in the placement of the outbuildings and tower antennas, the pattern grew clear. A 7-pointed star intersected by concentric circles. What does it mean? He asked quietly. Veronica shook her head. I don't know, but I've seen versions of that same diagram in places you wouldn't expect. European alchemical texts, 15th century cosmograms, even satellite calibration layouts used by the early CD programs. Different cultures, different times, same design. Matteo stepped back and stared at the chalkboard. Maybe it isn't just about walking, he said. Maybe it's about completing the shape, or unlocking something inside it. They worked in silence for an hour, comparing notes, sketching overlay maps, and debating symbolic interpretations. Matteo wanted to believe it was all coincidence, humans assigning meaning to patterns, grasping for structure in a world already frayed at the seams. But deep down, he had known from the beginning that the wire was more than performance. It had always been more. At sunset, he agreed to do a walk. Not the full crossing, not yet. Just a test on the main line. A slow advance out from the south tower with the balancing pole in full gear. He would step out a dozen meters, pause, and return. Veronica stood on the platform, arms folded, as he adjusted his harness. Her face was tight, the corners of her mouth drawn down. When he turned to face her, she nodded silently, and he nodded back. Matteo stepped onto the platform, lowered his foot to the wire, and tested its tension. It held. He shifted his weight, adjusted the pole, and began to walk. Step by step, the world behind him dropped away. The canyon fell into shadow beneath his feet, and the towers beneath him receded into peripheral haze. The wire sang beneath his boots, a faint vibration rising into his bones. He reached the midway point of his short walk and paused. Then he did something. He let go of the pole. He didn't plant it. He simply opened his hands and allowed the metal to fall. It should have tumbled into the canyon. It should have clanged once against the cliff, bounced, and vanished. Instead, it disappeared. Not fell, vanished. There was no sound or impact and no dust. It was simply gone, as if swallowed by the void. Matteo stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked back to the platform. Veronica met him at the edge. You dropped it, she said. I did. And it never landed. They both looked out at the wire together, and neither of them spoke again until morning. Part 4. Dawn arrived without brilliance. The sky brightened in slow increments, its hues washed out and clinical. When the sun finally crested the ridge, it cast a sterile light that drained color from the canyon rather than illuminating it. The landscape no longer shimmered. Mateo had risen early. He hadn't slept. From his perch atop the South Tower's scaffold, he watched the arrival of the broadcast crew. They came in 2 matte black trucks that descended the ridge with unnerving quiet. The men and women who stepped out wore matching utility gear, their movements coordinated but impersonal. They unpacked drone rigs and calibration instruments without discussion, stringing cables between antennae whose origin Mateo could not identify. No insignias adorned their vehicles, no logos marked their crates. Veronica stood several meters behind him, her arms crossed. She'd observed the preparations in silence until one of the technicians passed within arm's reach without acknowledging her presence. "They don't have names," she said. "No ID tags. No company markings. None of their equipment matches. If this is being broadcast, no one will admit to funding it." Mateo nodded without turning. From there, he could see the wire in full, stretching across the ravine. It no longer shimmered in the heat or bent the light, and now appeared fixed. As the crews prepared below, he continued his warm-up in silence. The movements felt hollow. Repetition had become meaningless. There was no sense of progression, only continuation. At 7 a.m., a single tone issued from a mounted speaker. It rose in pitch for exactly 3 seconds before cutting out. The technician raised one hand and announced, without emotion, 2 minutes to live feed. The voice was flat and artificial. It had no accent or inflection, and Mateo could not tell whether it had been spoken aloud or transmitted through a device. Veronica approached, placing one hand lightly on his shoulder. "Still don't have to do this." He met her eyes. "I'm not here to finish a performance. I'm here to break one." She didn't respond. Her hand dropped to her side, and she stepped back as she ascended the starting platform. The scaffolding had been reinforced since the test walk. Additional grip tape lined the rails, cameras mounted on gimbals followed his movement, but none made a sound. No crew directed the shots, no one counted down. He stepped onto the platform, adjusted his gloves, and scanned the wire. Its surface was taut, unblemished, and free of any visible point of origin. The North Tower mirrored its counterpart, though at this distance, the stone around it seemed less real. A voice repeated, "Live feed active." Then everything fell silent. Below him, the audience remained in place, their heads tilted upward, arms mid-motion. Their expressions had frozen. One woman's hands were poised together, fingers millimeters apart, as if waiting to clap. No one blinked. No one shifted. Mateo stepped forward. The first placement of his foot on the wire felt familiar, the movement coming from a place buried beneath practice and memory. The second step followed with the same certainty. The third resolved into a rhythm. He adjusted the pole across his shoulders and continued, each footfall landing with intention, no longer perceiving time and space. The wire beneath him held without complaint. When he reached the halfway point, he saw it. At the far end of the wire, a figure emerged. At first, he mistook it for his own shadow, stretched forward by the rising sun. Then the silhouette stepped forward, and the illusion fell apart. The figure matched his height and build exactly. Its gait mirrored his with impossible precision. Its arms extended with the same span. Its hands gripped a pole that reflected no light. Clothing matched his own, down to the seams and creases. At the level of detail, however, the imitation failed. Its posture lacked the minor imperfections of a living body. The sway of its hips came a fraction too late. The bend of the knees followed without casualty. The figure moved as if reenacting something already completed. Mateo stopped. The figure continued forward by 2 steps before halting in place. He shifted his weight to the left. The figure mirrored him, but not instantly. He raised his hand, and the figure responded. This time, its movement came first. He resumed walking, altering his pace. He shortened 1 step and extended the next. He began to move with irregular timing, inserting pauses and changing rhythm. The figure adjusted and began to anticipate. Each time he tried to disrupt his routine, the figure predicted his next move. When he leaned into his left foot, the figure had already mirrored the correction. When he raised the pole slightly above shoulder height, it had already moved to match the adjustment before his arms had fully lifted. The world began to distort. At first, it was subtle. The edges of the canyon bowed inward, creating the impression of concavity. The horizon tilted to the right. Clouds elongated into uneven threads. The North Tower extended vertically for several meters and then snapped back into place as if caught in a loop. And the figure resumed its walk. Mateo remained still. The audience below remained frozen. The space around the wire had been excised from the flow of time, or perhaps redirected. He could no longer tell whether the wire suspended him above the canyon or suspended the canyon beneath him. The figure advanced. Its face had become visible in full. It was his face, down to the scar near the jawline he had received at 16, when a misjudged dismount had introduced him to the edge of a steel support. But something in the symmetry had failed. The eyes did not track movement. They stared forward without recognition. The smile at the corner of the mouth held too long. Its arms adjusted the pole with an efficiency suggesting automation. The illusion of humanity collapsed. This was not a performer or even an imitator. It was a recording. It walked toward him as if guided by instructions he had unknowingly authored years earlier, and there was no stopping it. Part 4. The figure advanced with the certainty of someone retracing their own steps. Every aspect of its movement had been shaped in his image, but distorted in subtle, disturbing ways. Mateo had expected a confrontation, perhaps even a collapse of reality, but he had not anticipated the experience of watching himself rendered hollow. It stood before him now at the center of the span, no more than a few meters away. The illusion of humanity held only at a glance. Upon closer inspection, the facade fell apart. The eyes were shaped like his, but they reflected no ambient light and never shifted focus. The mouth remained slightly open, and the corners had split just past the natural range of motion, giving it the expression of a man mid-laugh who had forgotten how to stop. The symmetry of the face had been preserved, but only externally. No internal thought moved behind it. The arms adjusted the balancing pole with a familiarity that made Mateo's throat tighten. The motion was too smooth, and the limbs extended at angles that suggested more joints than should have existed in a human body. When it blinked, the eyelids dragged across the sockets a fraction too slowly, as if the memory of the action had degraded and was now being forced through a corrupted playback. Mateo didn't speak, nor did he shift his stance. Instead, he observed. The mirrored figure, a familiar sequence from one of his earliest televised performances, the same shallow tilt of the torso, the exacting positioning of the feet. He recognized it immediately. That walk had aired live in Sao Paulo, and the routine had been his father's invention, preserved and passed down as a kind of homage. Watching the figure perform it now felt less like a tribute and more like a theft. Then it changed. The figure began a routine Matteo had not performed publicly. It pivoted its shoulders into a 3-count sway and planted its weight into a heel turn that Matteo had only ever attempted once, during a private rehearsal with his father in a training facility outside Naples. No audience had been present, no cameras had recorded it. Yet here it was, recreated with mechanical accuracy. Matteo narrowed his eyes in recognition. This was not mimicry in the conventional sense. The figure was not observing and copying, but repeating. Somewhere beneath the fabric of the ritual, beneath whatever force had constructed this encounter, a record had been kept. The figure on the wire had not assembled itself by watching Matteo, but by absorbing the residue of his past. It was reanimating his choices, not just the ones made in public, but those he had long believed forgotten. He raised the balancing pole in contemplation. It rested across his palms, a familiar weight that had once steadied him in hundreds of performances across dozens of countries. He remembered when it had felt like a partner, an extension of his intent, a fulcrum between fear and precision. Now it felt like a relic from someone else's life. He opened his hands and the pole fell. Instead of tumbling into the depths of the canyon, it hovered in midair momentarily, motionless, before drifting sideways, slowly and without resistance, until it disappeared into a crease in the air itself. All the while, the figure remained motionless. In its arms, it held a replica of the same pole, but the ends had begun to blur. Matteo, of all people, knew the discipline the wire demanded, the structure around it, the ritual, the audience, the uncanny mirror had all been designed to feed on repetition. The walk was a reenactment of past forms, not an act of creation. Matteo understood now that the only way to end the madness was to deny it. He shifted his weight deliberately, but he chose to place his foot too far forward. The movement lacked refinement. He recovered his balance, but not gracefully. His hips overcompensated, and his shoulders swayed inconsistently. The figure across from him twitched. Its reaction came delayed by a beat, then two. Its shoulders adjusted, but the correction lacked precision. The pole it held bent slightly at the center, as though its form no longer registered with certainty. Matteo lifted one foot and positioned it over the cable for a full 3 seconds, holding an unsteady posture that any professional would have immediately corrected. Then he placed the foot down with a shuffle, his heel landing before the ball. The figure stuttered. Its left arm snapped upward, then corrected. The eyes rotated independently of the head, realigning after half a second. Its mouth twitched wider, the corners cracked. Matteo began to walk again, but this time he introduced errors with intention. He rotated his upper body before the lower half followed. He blinked in an erratic rhythm. He mothered a half-remembered lyric from a childhood song in the wrong key. With each imperfection, the figure's coordination degraded further. Its body attempted to follow, but the gestures no longer aligned. The pole shifted from a straight line into a jagged arc, and its feet pressed down with no visible reaction from the wire. The space beneath it had started to ripple, and the tower behind it pulsed faintly. Matteo reached for the tether clipped to his harness. His fingers unfastened the latch without hesitation. He did not intend to fall. That was not the point. The point was to break the seal that had been written into the performance. The figure lunged. However, its movement lacked structure. It propelled forward as if the idea of proximity were more important than physics. Its arms extended too wide, and the pole it held cracked open lengthwise, separating into interlocking strands that unraveled as they moved. Mateo did not brace for impact or attempt to dodge or resist. Instead, he stepped forward and raised his arms. When the figure collided with him, the wire did not bend. There was no recoil, no displacement. The two bodies overlapped, their forms meeting without violence, folding into one another in a manner that defied material comprehension. There was no flash, no sound, only a collapse. The figure's gestures, routines, tics, all the rehearsed fragments of his history, dissolved as if returning to their source. The sensation was strange, like that of a memory being returned to storage. For a moment, everything went still. Then, high above the canyon, where two figures had stood moments earlier, there only remained one faint disturbance in the air. It rippled once and then contracted, leaving the wire perfectly still. Across the ravine, the audience had remained motionless. The hands that had nearly clapped remained suspended. The towers stood as they had before, and the wire held its form, but the note it emitted, faint, continuous, and almost inaudible, had changed. Part 6. Mateo awoke on bare stone, face turned toward a sky that had shifted in hue. The sun hovered behind cloud cover, muted and distant, as though filtered through layers of mist or memory. His limbs ached in a way that felt structural rather than muscular, as if the process of re-entering his own body had introduced strain to the architecture of his bones. He didn't move at first. The texture of the rock beneath him felt unnaturally smooth, wind-polished, but without grit. The wire was no longer beneath his feet. The harness, the gloves, the tether were all gone. His clothes were unchanged, but something within him had been reconfigured, and he could not yet identify what had been removed. The sound that brought him back to himself was that of a breath, shallow, measured, and close. He turned his head and found Veronica seated beside him. Her posture had collapsed inward, and her clothes were coated in red dust. Her eyes, though open, held the emptiness of someone who had watched a process unfold that she did not understand, but could no longer deny. "You're back," she said. He noticed that her voice and cadence had changed. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but hesitated. "You walked for 7 days," she said. "You never stopped, not once." Mateo blinked. The sensation was unfamiliar, as if eyelids had only just been reassigned to his face. "I don't remember any of it." She nodded without surprise. "You started walking before the sun had fully risen. You reached the midpoint, and something changed. The rest wasn't walking. It was..." Her voice faltered. "It was continuous. No breaks, water, or food. You didn't respond to anyone. You didn't fall, but you didn't perform either." He sat up slowly. His back cracked at the base of his spine, and the pop echoed across the ledge louder than it should have. The towers stood still. The wires still stretched between them, but it no longer shimmered. Whatever had animated its impossible tension seemed to have dissipated. It sagged now, only slightly, but enough to notice. She followed his gaze. "It changed after you stopped. Or maybe it stopped after you changed. I'm not sure anymore." He touched the ground with his fingertips. The stone no longer hummed. The silence around him was natural again, filled with the occasional whisper of wind and the distant thrum of insects. The compound had emptied. No technicians remained, no trucks, no antennas, no cameras. "How long was it gone?" he asked. Veronica closed her eyes. 7 days here, but I don't know what that means anymore. He rose to his feet. The movement was smoother than expected. Whatever damage his body should have sustained had not manifested. He felt intact, but dislocated, as if the boundaries between his awareness and his surroundings had thinned. She rose as well. You merged with it. Mateo tilted his head. The thing, she said, the figure, saw it. Just once from the southern tower. I watched it reach you, then you were both gone. He breathed in, testing the air for scent, but detected only dust and heat. It wasn't trying to replace me. It was trying to complete me. Veronica's eyes flicked toward the sagging wire. Or complete the ritual. They walked in silence along the edge of the cliff back toward the trail that led to the lower camp. The camp had been stripped of structure. Even the portable bunkhouse had collapsed, as though folded into itself. Only a few metal pegs and a torn sheet of weatherproof plastic remained, fluttering weakly. They reached the transport jeep. It sat with its doors open, keys still in the ignition. Mateo climbed into the passenger's side without speaking. Veronica took the wheel, though her hands trembled when she gripped it. The vehicle started without protest, and they drove away from the canyon without looking back. Months passed. The city skyline emerged against the colorless dusk. The glass towers reflected lights not yet lit, and cranes rotated in slow arcs across rooftops that had no clear architectural history. Near the heart of the business district, two newly erected towers stood in defiance of zoning laws, constructed faster than materials should have allowed. Between them, a wire stretched across the sky. It was thinner than standard rigging and anchored without visible mounts. No official press release had acknowledged its presence. No permits had been filed, and no show had been scheduled. At street level, a child stood beside a vendor cart, clutching a paper cone filled with roasted nuts. He looked upward, his eyes narrowed against the descending twilight. A figure had begun walking the wire. It moved effortlessly, with its body parallel to the line, its hands splayed outward, its spine arched in a curve too symmetrical to be maintained by muscle alone. The boy blinked and tugged at his mother's sleeve. But when she turned, the figure had already passed behind the neighboring structure. Inside a nearby office building, Mateo stood beside a window. He wore a dark blazer, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His face had aged, though not in the way most would recognize. The years had not creased his skin or dimmed his eyes, but rather hollowed something beneath the surface. He held a glass in one hand, untouched. The television mounted above the office desk remained muted. The headlines scrolled without context. He watched the sky. Behind him, the elevator chimed. He didn't bother to turn. Instead, he muttered to himself, his voice almost too quiet to carry. It's not me this time, but it still knows my name. That was The Wire Between Worlds by Alessandro Viscari, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry.
A legacy that loops on itself, and a wire that ends wherever you stop believing in it. That story gave me vertigo, Otis.
Well, walk long enough through someone else's past, and you might find yourself walking into your own reflection. Or worse, someone else's.
And speaking of legacies gone sideways, our next story starts with an unmarked crate and ends with something crawling where it doesn't belong. It starts simple, just a package at the dock. No label, no return address, but inside, a species nobody can identify, and in the dark corners of a meat packing plant, evolution starts to get ideas of its own. This is Crickets by Beau Grissom, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood. Part 1. Jacob Ellery moved with the quiet efficiency of habit, his worn sneakers whispering across the linoleum floor as he made his final rounds through the aisles of Ellery's Pet Supplies. The air smelled faintly of wood shavings, dry kibble, and reptile substrate, a scent he had long since ceased to notice. With practiced ease, he checked the timers on the heat lamps, filled the last water bowls, and scribbled a note for himself about ordering more feeder mice. The store was quiet, save for the occasional rustle from one of the enclosures. Most of the animals were settling into their nocturnal rhythms. His leopard geckos were already huddled under their hides, and the corn snakes lay coiled beneath their heat mats, their eyes dull in the dim glow of the enclosure lights. He paused by the skink's terrarium, watching the little creature nose around its freshly misted tank. He tapped the glass gently, then clicked off the overheads row by row until the place stood cloaked in soft twilight. It was past closing, nearly 10:30, and Jacob had been looking forward to a cold drink and some leftover stir-fry. He was halfway to locking the front door when a low rumble interrupted him. A delivery truck turning into the alley beside the building. That struck him as odd. Deliveries came in the morning, always between 9 and 11, and always by the same friendly, talkative guy named Paul. Jacob stepped outside, squinting into the wash of headlights. The truck that backed into the narrow lot bore no markings, no company logo, and no familiar humming from the refrigerated compartments. The driver's cab windows were tinted too dark to see inside. It rolled to a halt and idled for a moment before the back doors swung open with a soft clunk. Jacob waited, unsettled by the silence. When the driver appeared, he wasn't Paul. He was taller, thinner, and wore a generic brown jacket that didn't match any shipping company Jacob recognized. The man didn't say a word. He simply wheeled a dolly forward with a single, medium-sized wooden crate strapped to its base. Jacob took a step closer. "This isn't my usual delivery time," he said. "What company are you with?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he pulled a tablet from under his arm, extended it with one hand, and pointed to the screen with the other. His finger tapped the signature line. Jacob hesitated. The crate bore a printed label that read, "Live Feed, Crickets, Handle with Care." The shipping address matched the store, and the supplier was the same exotic insect farm in Arizona he'd used for years. Still, something about the man's silence and the way he stared without blinking made Jacob's skin itch. "Late run, huh?" he muttered, reaching for the stylus. He signed quickly and handed the tablet back. The driver gave a single nod, wheeled the crate inside the threshold, and left without another glance. The truck pulled away without reversing beeps or farewell, its taillights vanishing into the night. Jacob stood by the crate for a moment, listening to the truck rumble away into the distance. He bent down, testing the weight. It was heavier than a standard cricket shipment, which usually came in lightweight plastic containers and wriggled with noise the moment they were disturbed. This crate was quiet and tightly sealed, and its wood felt warm beneath his palms. He wrestled it inside and set it down near the reptile feeding prep area. The packaging was clean, but something caught his eye. A set of puncture holes near one corner of the lid, just above a small plastic viewing window. He leaned in, peering through the scratched plexiglass, but could make out little in the gloom. There was no movement, only a vague sense of mass. He thought he heard a faint scrape, like claws or legs brushing against plastic, but it stopped before he could be sure. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly 11, far too late to start sorting feeders now. He made a mental note to open it first thing in the morning, perhaps record a few clips for the shop's social media. Unboxing Day usually got a few likes from the local herpetology crowd. He taped a quick label on the side for himself and shut off the rest of the lights. Outside, the street was empty. There was no sign of the driver or the truck, and the stillness of the block settled heavily over the storefront. He locked up, pausing to double-check the back entrance and the interior security system, then left the crate in the dark, tucked between the lizard chow bins and the dusty freezer full of frozen rodents. The bell over the door gave a soft, final chime as he stepped out into the cold. Part 2. The first rays of morning sun hadn't yet cleared the rooftops when Jacob returned to the store, a thermal mug of coffee in one hand and his keys jangling in the other. The air was brisk, a thin sheen of frost on the sidewalk, catching the light from the still glowing street lamps. He paused at the door, glancing briefly through the glass. Everything inside looked undisturbed. He unlocked the door, stepped in, and was greeted by the familiar warmth and scent of animal bedding. The low hum of heaters and filtration systems filled the silence, punctuated by the rustle of movement in a few enclosures as his animals stirred with him. Jacob flipped the switch near the register, and the main lights came on with a soft click, flooding the aisles with artificial day. He moved through his routine with practiced speed, checking temperatures, refreshing water dishes, and noting which feeders were running low. It was only when he reached the back storage corner that he remembered the late delivery. The crate sat exactly where he had left it, tucked behind the freezer chest. A thin ring of condensation had gathered around its base from the morning chill, and the puncture holes along the top edge were now clearly visible in the light. He frowned, then knelt beside it and began cutting the plastic wrap and staples with a box cutter. The wooden lid came off with a creak of protestation. Inside, there were 3 sealed plastic tubs, darker and deeper than the usual cricket containers, with tinted lids that obscured the contents. One had the corner vents punctured outward, as though something had pushed through from inside. A soft, rhythmic clicking could be heard when he lifted it. Cautiously, Jacob peeled back the lid. Inside, the insects were already awake. They weren't crickets, not by any standard he recognized. At first glance, they seemed close, roughly the same size, about 2 inches long, with long hind legs and segmented antennae, but their bodies were glossy and sharply ridged, with hard carapaces that shimmered faintly in the light. Their eyes were bulbous and faceted, but darker than those of a cricket, almost black and strangely expressive. There were perhaps 7 or 8 of them clustered along the base of the tub. As the lid came off, every one of them turned simultaneously to face him, not in a random, twitchy scatter, but with perfect alignment, as if a signal had passed between them. Jacob blinked and leaned closer, studying them through the fogged plastic. They didn't move. They watched. He dealt with enough feeders over the years to know how they behaved. Restless, easily startled. These didn't skitter. They adjusted their stance when he leaned in, 3 of them raising their front limbs slightly. Another rotated in place and seemed to click a few short bursts toward the others. The rest shifted accordingly. Jacob swallowed hard, realizing what it looked like. Communication. He reached for his tweezers, the long curved kind he used for handling feeder insects, and slowly eased one of the creatures toward the top of the container. It resisted, digging in with a set of tiny claws. He tried again, applying a little more pressure, and the thing twisted around and locked its forelimbs around the metal tip, holding fast. "Jesus," Jacob muttered. He tilted the tweezers, trying to break its grip. With effort, he managed to pry it loose and drop it into a small specimen cup. It clicked violently against the sides for a moment, then stilled. The others in the tub shifted slightly again, fanning their antennae and aligning along the wall closest to the now missing member. Jacob brought the specimen cup to the front room, still unsettled. The skink, resting in its enclosure near the window, was fully awake now and nosing at the front glass in anticipation of breakfast. "Well," he murmured, "let's see what you make of this." He opened the enclosure, placed the cup inside, and tipped it gently. The insect spilled out, landed upright, and froze. The skink, tongue flicking, approached with casual interest. What followed lasted less than 3 seconds. The insect launched itself forward, unhinged its jaws, and latched onto the skink's neck. A set of secondary mandibles emerged from within its jaw structure, thin, pale, and bladed, and sliced into the reptile with surgical precision. The skink thrashed once, violently, and then went limp. The insect began consuming it. Jacob staggered back a step. The insect's thorax expanded and contracted as it fed. Its slick limbs braced against the body of the skink. A viscous fluid began to seep from the torn hide. The creature wasn't tearing chunks. It was absorbing. He saw muscle tissue dissolve as the insect burrowed deeper with its needle-like appendages. Horrified, Jacob reached for the tank lid and dropped it down, sealing the thing inside. The insect reacted instantly, racing up the side and slamming into the glass with enough force to make it crack. Over and over again it struck the tank until hairline fractures began to form. Jacob backed away, feeling the instinct to put distance between himself and whatever he had just let loose. He turned, heading back toward the storage crate, suddenly desperate to inspect the rest. The other containers were empty. He froze. The tubs sat neatly where he'd left them, but their lids had been pushed slightly ajar. There was no movement inside and no trace of the insects, just faint residue at the bottom of each. And in one of them, he spotted a single fragment of what looked like shredded plastic. He scanned the floor. There were no trails, fluttering antennae, or shadows slipping behind the shelving units. The room was utterly silent. Jacob turned toward the ceiling vents, then toward the small gap beneath the storage room door. Somewhere behind the walls, he thought he heard a faint scraping sound, rhythmic and brief, barely audible above the hum of the store's HVAC system. Then, everything went quiet again. Part 3. Jacob kept his eyes on the crate as he reached for the shop phone. He pressed the number for the supplier's helpline, the same one he'd used for years, usually to check back orders or delay a delivery. A few rings in, the line clicked and shifted to an automated voice. "Thank you for calling Sandridge Exotics. Our normal business hours are 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. For emergency concerns, please press 4. He did. Another pause, followed by a different voice, an older recording. "You have reached the emergency dispatch for Sandridge Exotics. Please leave a message and a representative will return your call as soon as possible." There was no tone, just silence. Jacob pressed the number again. This time, the line rang once and then dropped entirely. A short burst of static blared through the speaker before the call disconnected. He frowned, hung up, and pulled out his phone to look up the company's site directly. The page loaded, same logo, same lizard mascot, but the phone number listed didn't match the one on the box label or his receipt. He tried the new one and was promptly sent to voicemail again. There was no option for immediate assistance. He set the receiver down and turned toward the back room, where the tub lids now sat at odd angles, one resting on its side. A small trail of dust led to the baseboards behind the reptile supply shelf, but when he crouched to inspect it, the line simply stopped, as if the insect had vanished. His thoughts turned toward pest control. He had the number of a guy, Manny, who serviced a few nearby shops, but how would he even explain it? "Hey, Manny, you ever deal with a box of misidentified feeder crickets that coordinated a breakout, murdered a lizard, and then disappeared into the air ducts?" He stepped away from the crate and walked toward the main counter, intending to pull up the shop's security system. As he passed the supply shelf, he caught a flicker of movement in the periphery of his vision, too quick and low to register clearly. He spun toward it, but there was nothing there but the mop sink and the closed janitor's closet. He reached the computer and pulled up the footage from the night before. The timestamp showed 10:52 p.m., just after the delivery. He fast-forwarded to midnight, then again to 3:12 a.m., when the overhead night vision system had picked up motion in the storage room. He froze the frame. On screen, the tubs were no longer still. They rocked in place, their lids trembling as something moved beneath. The lid of the tub nearest the camera slid sideways, and one of the creatures climbed out. It was followed by another, and another. They gathered on the edge of the crate, their antennae waving in short bursts. Then they turned in unison and dropped to the floor, disappearing off camera. Jacob clicked to a different angle, one covering the front aisle. 4 of them passed into view near the dog toy section, moving with uncanny precision. They paused beneath the register and then, one by one, climbed the leg of a nearby display stand. At the top, one creature perched near the store's central air vent, turned its head sharply, and began clawing at the aluminum mesh. Another joined it. He skipped ahead. By 4:05 a.m., the vent was gone, the mesh torn away. The insects had vanished. A sudden crash shattered the stillness, and Jacob bolted upright. It had come from the front room. He ran down the aisle and rounded the corner just as the tank exploded in a scatter of safety glass and flying gravel. The skink's enclosure had been destroyed from the inside. A dense web of cracks radiated from the lower corner, and the insect was nowhere to be seen. He approached carefully, avoiding the broken glass. A smear of organic residue trailed off the edge of the cabinet, sticky and gray-green. He followed it to the floor, where it stopped cold, with no clear direction, footprints, or further trail. Jacob moved quickly, ducking behind the counter and pulling on his thickest handling gloves from beneath the register. He retrieved the canister of aerosol mite spray used for reptile enclosures. It wasn't designed to kill anything large, but it might buy him a moment if he got close enough. When he returned to the back room, the tubs were completely still, and the inside walls were dry. Even the faint traces of webbing or claw residue had vanished. He examined the crate again, finding no sign of a breach, and yet all the containers were empty. He moved methodically through the shop, checking beneath racks and shelves, scanning the corners of the ceiling and the undersides of the furniture, and detected no motion or sound. Finally, at a loss, he stood still in the center of the reptile section, listening. Everything was still. The vents were silent. The walls creaked once, softly, and then quieted. The shop, for the moment, at least, was peaceful. Jacob glanced back at the shattered tank, then at the sealed storage tubs. He tried to recall how many of the insects had originally been in the container. Was it 7? 8? Maybe more? He couldn't recall. They'd moved quickly and silently, and the camera footage had only captured a few frames before they disappeared. A tight knot of unease formed at the base of his throat as he realized they must still be in the store, somewhere, watching. Part 4. Jacob didn't go home that night. He told himself he was just staying late to monitor things, to protect the remaining animals, maybe install a few extra cameras. But beneath the excuses was something colder and far less rational. He didn't trust the store anymore. Not the walls, not the shadows between the racks, and certainly not the silence. He sat in the manager's chair behind the register, sipping flat soda from a paper cup, watching the surveillance feed on his laptop. Every motion sensor in the store was active, and he'd left every aisle light on, flooding the building with a clinical, buzzing glow. But the insects hadn't shown themselves since morning, not to the naked eye at least. The only signs of their presence came through the cameras. At 11:17 p.m., the feed from camera 3, focused on the far side of the reptile aisle, showed a single insect creeping along the shelving unit that held the UV bulbs and heat mats. It paused at the second shelf, then slowly began dragging a length of packaging wire from behind a filter box. It turned, rotated the wire once, and laid it across the top edge of the shelf. Seconds later, another appeared in frame. This one was larger and moved differently, its posture more upright. The front limbs held in a way that reminded Jacob, absurdly, of a mantis examining prey. It climbed to meet the first and worked beside it, adjusting the angle of the wire. They were building something, or preparing. Jacob stared at the screen, unwilling to blink. By 11:20, the two insects had repositioned the wire around the base of the overhead light fixture. The bulb flickered once, dimmed, and then returned to normal. Both creatures turned in tandem and disappeared down the backside of the shelf. Jacob pushed away from the desk and stood, his hand resting on the edge of the counter for balance. The soda sat forgotten beside the register. He crossed to the aisle and walked its length, eyes scanning every shelf and fixture. Nothing stirred. No shadows shifted. No glass tanks rattled. The packaging wire was no longer visible. He looked up to where the light fixture above the UV bulbs buzzed faintly, flickering at the edges of his peripheral vision. He backed away, and as he did, a soft noise followed, barely audible, a metallic scrape, thin and dry, coming from somewhere near the back stockroom. He turned toward it, moving slowly, and held his breath. The sound continued in short bursts, like claws or tools gently prying at something resistant. He paused at the stockroom door. The noise, he realized, was definitely coming from inside the wall. The corner vent, about 4 feet from the floor, looked untouched, but he could hear movement behind it. Not animalistic, but frighteningly measured and purposeful. He stepped back into the main room, returned to the laptop, and pulled up camera 6, the interior storage view. What he saw made his stomach twist. 2 insects had emerged from the rear supply shelves. One was perched on the handle of a rolling cart. The other clung to the underside of the central prep table. They moved with eerie silence, each taking turns repositioning the small objects left on the floor. Bottle caps, feeding tongs, bits of packaging tape. They were arranging them into patterns of lines, arcs, and grids. It resembled the beginning of a map, or perhaps a diagram. He couldn't tell if they were trying to communicate or coordinate, but he was certain they weren't random. He pulled the laptop closer, switching feeds. Camera 4, near the front entrance, came to life. Another insect had climbed onto the countertop display beside the impulse buy snacks and leashes. It leaned against the small metal sign that read, "Locally owned since 1997, and slowly tilted it forward, positioning it so it faced the store entrance. It stayed there for a full minute, unmoving, before crawling out of frame. The lights above the register dimmed briefly, and Jacob jerked his head up. The fluorescence buzzed louder and then stabilized. They're testing the power grid, he thought. They're familiarizing themselves with it. A surge of adrenaline pushed him back into motion. He gathered the laptop, a flashlight, and a small toolkit, then retreated into the supply room and shut the door behind him. The lock wasn't built for real security, just a standard bolt, but he reinforced it with a short metal shelf and a rolling chair, jamming both beneath the handle. The air was stale and considerably warmer in the room. It smelled faintly of pet food, cardboard, and oil from the mop bucket in the corner. Jacob sat cross-legged behind the shelving and reopened the security feed, scanning each angle. The insects had returned to the camera view. 3 of them now stood at the threshold of the back hallway. One held its body pressed to the seam of the wall, its mandibles twitching. Another slowly approached the door, tapping at the metal frame in quick, rhythmic bursts. The third remained farther back, watching, standing guard. Then one began to climb. It scaled the corner of the frame and curled its body along the door jamb, antennae probing the screw heads in the upper hinge. Jacob could see them begin to turn. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He adjusted the camera angle, closer now. The screws were moving. The metal twisted in small jerks, clockwise, then counterclockwise, as if tiny hands were working in coordination. The insects were removing the door. Then, without warning, one of them turned. It moved to the opposite wall and reared up, extending both front limbs toward the camera. Its eyes locked onto the lens. For the first time, Jacob felt unmistakably seen. The insect reached forward, touched the camera housing, and tilted its head. Then it clicked something beneath the lens, and the feed went black. Only the soft scraping beyond the door remained. Dear God, he thought. They understood the purpose of the security cameras. Part 5. Jacob gripped his phone with both hands, fingers trembling against the screen as he scrolled to the pest control contact list he kept stored in the shop's emergency folder. He dialed Manny's number first. The call rang 3 times before a groggy voice picked up. "Yeah?" Manny sounded like he'd been asleep. "Manny, it's Jacob, Ellery's Pet Supplies." "What time is it?" "Almost midnight," Jacob said. He tried to steady his voice. "I need you to come out here. Now. I've got an infestation that's not normal." There was a beat of silence on the line. "What kind of infestation?" Jacob didn't know how to answer without sounding unhinged. "Insects. Big. Coordinated. One killed a skink and cracked the tank. They're inside the walls now, in the vents." Manny sighed. "Look, man, I can come by, but it's going to be a few. I got to throw on pants and grab my kit. This ain't exactly emergency services." Jacob closed his eyes. "Please, hurry." He ended the call and immediately dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? "My name is Jacob Ellery. I own a pet store on East Bramble and Oak. Something got delivered to me, not what I ordered, something alive, and it's loose in my building. I don't know what it is, but it attacked one of my animals. Now it's trying to get through the supply room door. I called pest control, but by the time they get here, it might be too late." "Sir, are you in immediate danger?" Yes, I'm in danger. That's what I've been telling you. You've got to believe me. They're trying to unscrew the hinges." "They?" "Insects. Big ones. Not like anything I've seen. At least half a dozen. They're intelligent and organized. They're removing hardware from the door. Please, you've got to help me." Another pause. "Are you under the influence of any substances, Mr. Ellery?" Jacob let out a short, bitter laugh. "I'm not high, and I'm not crazy. Just send someone, please." "All right, we're dispatching a unit now." He remained crouched in the supply room, every muscle tense, eyes locked on the monitor of his laptop. The remaining interior camera showed the hallway outside. Nothing moved. The insects had retreated from the door after disabling the other feed, but he knew they hadn't left. He could feel them, listening and waiting. 15 minutes passed before, finally, there was movement on the street. The exterior camera caught it first. Manny's faded blue van pulling into the alley lot. A moment later, the brighter headlights of a patrol car rolled up behind him. Jacob switched to the front camera feed as the pest control tech stepped out, dressed in a zip-up hoodie and jeans, a silver case under one arm. Officer Dana Castillo exited her cruiser with more caution, scanning the storefront as she adjusted her radio. Jacob activated the store's speaker intercom and pressed the button. "Manny, officer, I'm in the back. Don't come inside alone." Both figures looked up, startled. "Jacob?" Manny called. "Yes. Listen carefully. The insects are inside. They're not normal. If you open the door, go slowly. Move together. Keep the lights on." The officer tilted her head, hand hovering near her holster. "Sir, I need to confirm your safety. Are you hurt?" "I'm okay for now. I'm in the back supply room. They tried to breach it earlier. They're hiding now." Manny turned toward the door and swiped his card on the access pad. The lock clicked. Together, he and Castillo pushed into the entryway. The camera inside the front room followed them as they entered. Jacob watched on the feed as they moved cautiously through the lobby, the officer sweeping her flashlight across the aisles. Manny stayed close behind, holding a spray canister of industrial pest repellent in one hand, the metal case dangling from his shoulder strap. "Nothing yet," the officer muttered. "Place looks clean." Manny reached for the wall switch and flicked it upward. Fluorescence buzzed to life overhead. At first, the brightness seemed to settle the room. Then a faint clatter came from the ceiling. Jacob leaned closer to the screen. The vent grating above the reptile aisle popped loose. Something spilled down, a flash of segmented limbs and glossy black carapace, and landed directly on Castillo's shoulder. She shouted, swatting at it, but a second creature dropped from the opposite side and latched onto her leg. Manny tried to intervene, swinging his case, but another insect darted up his back and hooked its forelimbs around his neck. The feed went chaotic, blurred motion, falling displays, a burst of static as the camera jolted from impact. Jacob saw Officer Castillo go down, her flashlight tumbling across the floor. More of them swarmed into frame, emerging from vents, from behind shelving, even from within the false bottom of the freezer unit. They came fast, dozens of spindly legs clicking against tile. One reared up and spat something at Manny's face, clear, fast-moving, and he collapsed seconds later, convulsing. Castillo reached for her sidearm. She fired once, but her hand was dragged down before she could take a second shot. The bullet hit a fluorescent tube, showering glass across the room. The feed flickered, briefly stabilized, and then showed her being pulled out of frame. Jacob stared at the monitor. The screen showed only the front room again. It was quiet and dim, with no bodies in sight. Only a blood trail and the faint outline of claw marks near the wall where the freezer used to stand. Then, the feed froze. Jacob closed the laptop and leaned against the shelving unit, chest tight, arms limp at his sides. He was alone again, and no one else was coming. Part 6. The first bolt popped from the top hinge with a dry metallic ping. Jacob pressed his shoulder against the supply room door, bracing for the final breach. The chair beneath the handle groaned as pressure mounted from the other side. A second bolt twisted loose, dropping to the concrete floor. He waited, but nothing followed. A moment later, the sound ceased, and the pressure on the door relaxed. Still, he remained frozen in place, sweat beading along his brow, unsure whether it was a feint. Seconds passed in silence, and then minutes. Jacob slid the chair aside slowly and knelt to peer through the narrow gap between the door and the frame. The hallway was empty. He took a deep breath and unlocked the latch. The door creaked open an inch at a time. Every nerve in his body flinched as he expected to see one of them waiting, curled against the frame, ready to strike. But no movement greeted him. The hallway remained still, dust hanging in the air. He stepped out carefully, keeping low, his ears turned to any noise. The lights above flickered faintly, casting unreliable illumination across the floor. The security camera at the far end was dark, its lens smashed. The reptile aisle looked as though a hurricane had passed through it. Shelving units had been overturned, heat lamps lay shattered on the tile, and a trail of greenish liquid streaked across the floor where one of the insects had dragged a body out of view. The freezer door stood wide open. There was no sign of Manny or Officer Castillo. Jacob scanned the wreckage but saw no bodies, only torn equipment, splintered plastic, and deep, jagged scratches along the walls where the insects had climbed and clung. A sick realization gripped him. They had taken the victims with them. He moved slowly toward the front counter, avoiding the largest piles of debris, his eyes flicking toward every shadow and vent cover. The bell above the door hung twisted, barely attached. Beyond the glass storefront, the street lay bathed in the dim orange glow of the alley's overhead lamp. For a brief moment, Jacob thought perhaps they had gone, retreated back into whatever hole they had emerged from. Then he saw them. 6 of the creatures crawled along the edge of the sidewalk, their movements unnervingly fluid. 2 of them flanked the entrance to the neighboring building, a squat brick structure housing Pepe's Tacos and More, a 24-hour restaurant popular with the graveyard shift crowd and drunk college students. Jacob pressed closer to the glass. The insects were gathering beneath the patio awning, slipping under the metal railings and disappearing into the decorative hedges that lined the perimeter. One of them crawled up the side of the outdoor signpost, its limbs spread wide to keep balance, and perched beside the neon logo. Its antennae flicked forward. Jacob looked past it, through the wide windows of the restaurant. Inside, a handful of customers sat hunched over paper baskets of tacos and burritos. A man in a beanie scrolled on his phone. 2 women shared nachos at the corner booth. A cook behind the counter leaned against the wall, wiping his hands on his apron as he glanced toward the fryer. None of them knew. Before Jacob had time to consider his next move, the creatures were already in motion. He watched one slink through the base of the building's ventilation shaft, followed by a second and a third. Another crawled under the lip of the patio floor. They moved methodically, in silence and without frenzy, as though fully aware that their prey was oblivious. Jacob's hand trembled as he touched the glass. He wanted to shout at them to run for their lives, to run across the lot and pound on the windows. But what would that do, besides alert the insects to his location? His mind was spinning with the image of Castillo's final moments. If those things could dismantle a trained officer, he wondered, how long would it take to tear him apart? Inside the restaurant, the man in the beanie stood and stretched. Behind him, just out of sight, a shadow moved behind the counter. Jacob watched helplessly as one of the creatures launched itself onto the cook's back. The man stumbled, screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the sudden shatter of glass. The creature had flung him forward through a rack of trays. Another burst came from beneath the customer booth. The 2 women stood in shock for a second too long and were pulled violently beneath the table. Screams erupted. Customers rushed toward the exit, but 2 of the creatures were already waiting by the door, limbs outstretched. One man kicked wildly, then vanished behind the counter, dragged by his ankle. A chair crashed through one of the windows. A woman in an apron leapt through the opening, screaming into the night as blood streaked across her arms. She made it 6 steps before something clamped onto her leg and brought her down just beyond the curb. Jacob stepped back from the glass, bile rising in his throat. Chaos spilled from the restaurant into the parking lot. A man bolted toward a parked car, fumbled with his keys, then dropped to the asphalt as one of the creatures leapt from above and pinned him to the hood. Another person tried to flee across the alley, but was intercepted at the edge of the dumpster enclosure. Jacob looked toward the edge of the block. There were no sirens or lights. No help was coming, at least not yet. And even if they did, he wondered if it would make any difference. All he could see was the quiet sprawl of the town, sleeping quietly, wholly unaware that something awful was happening and that it was about to get a whole lot worse. Part 7. Minutes later, red and blue lights bloomed across the storefront glass. Jacob pressed his back to the interior wall of the shop, out of sight, but close enough to monitor the chaos unfolding outside. The faint hum of sirens grew louder as a caravan of emergency vehicles swept into the parking lot. 2 cruisers, a fire engine, and an ambulance, all flanked by a tactical response van that rumbled to a stop behind Pepe's. Officers in Kevlar moved quickly, shouting orders and waving civilians away. One of them guided the bloodied woman, still shaking, barefoot and dazed, toward the paramedics. Another crouched beside the man on the hood of his car, checking for vitals. Jacob watched from his phone's camera feed as the officers spread out across the restaurant's perimeter, weapons drawn. Flashlights swept across broken windows and scattered debris. One officer tapped at his chest mic and called something into dispatch. The footage offered a momentary illusion of order, of professionals stepping into the breach, ready to restore control. But Jacob had seen what these things could do, and he knew it wouldn't be enough. The first sign came from the alley. A shape moved low against the curb, flicking forward with unnerving speed. A second followed, then a third. Their glossy exoskeletons caught only slivers of light as they darted beneath cars and coiled near wheel wells. None of the officers saw them at first, not until a young responder reached to open the back of the tactical van. An insect launched itself from beneath the vehicle and clamped onto his forearm, jaws sliding open with a wet click. He screamed, but not for long. The creature burrowed beneath the armor plates, vanishing into the gaps of his gear. 2 others sprang onto the hood, forcing the windshield inward with their combined strength. Another officer raised a shotgun and fired. The blast knocked one of the insects sideways, cracking its carapace, but it didn't die. It shrieked, spun upright, and rushed the shooter. Its limbs moved like razors. Jacob watched the feed in mute horror as the remaining creatures emerged from all sides. They came from the gutters, the dumpsters, even the storm drain near the sidewalk. It was as though the earth itself had opened to deliver them. The responders tried to form a perimeter, firing in coordinated bursts, but the insects adapted. They darted from blind angles, leapt over shields, and broke out of formation. One officer attempted to pull a creature off his partner, only to have his wrist snapped by a pair of vice-like mandibles. Flashes lit the lot, muzzle bursts, warning strobes, a flare from a canister of pepper foam. None of it slowed them. One by one, the responders fell. Some were dragged under vehicles, while others simply vanished from the frame. Jacob closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the tactical van's windshield had collapsed inward. Smoke rose from a punctured tire. The woman who had escaped the restaurant lay slumped beside a paramedic unit, unmoving. Then, as suddenly as the violence had begun, new headlights swept across the scene. 5 unmarked vans pulled in from the far end of the block. They didn't arrive with sirens or flash warning lights. They came quietly and efficiently, their engines smooth and electric. The first van halted near the smashed cruiser, and its doors opened. Men in black gear stepped out. Their uniforms bore no insignia, and their masks had no visors. Each carried a compact, unfamiliar device that resembled a cross between a leaf blower and a weaponized fogger. They moved without hesitation, with silent determination. The lead agent raised his device and activated it. A plume of dense, shimmering gas burst forward, halting one of the insects mid-lunge. It froze instantly, its legs twitching. Its forward momentum faltered. It staggered sideways, clicking violently, and then collapsed. Another agent advanced, spraying a tight arc across the patio where 2 insects had climbed the brick siding. They dropped, one after the other, writhing briefly before falling still. The creatures didn't cry out or flee, but simply stopped. Jacob watched as the agents worked in synchronized lines, sweeping the area with calm precision. Each time a creature dropped, a second agent moved in behind the gas trail, carrying a silver containment tube the size of a duffel bag. The bodies, still twitching, were lifted in with padded instruments and sealed away. In less than 5 minutes, the lot was quiet again. 6 insects were recovered. 2 others, immobilized but not dead, were placed in military-grade restraints and carried to a reinforced transport unit. 1, larger than the others, required a full body clamp and a sealed exosuit chamber to be lifted safely. Jacob remained behind the glass, unmoving. No one approached the pet store. No one called for survivors. The agents didn't look around or search the surrounding shops. Their task was narrow and surgical. It was not merely containment, but retrieval. One of the agents moved toward the ambulance. He spoke to the sole surviving paramedic in a tone Jacob couldn't hear. Whatever was said, it required no discussion. The paramedic nodded, climbed into the vehicle, and drove away without using his lights, looking as if he'd seen a ghost. Soon, the vans reversed out of the lot and disappeared into the night. The ruined taco shop remained dark, its neon sign flickering behind the cracked window. Jacob stood alone in the hollow stillness, bathed in the faint blue haze of his phone screen. The front of his store looked like a war zone. Blood stained the pavement just outside. A severed antennae lay beside the threshold. And no one had even asked if he needed help. Part 8. The lights in the storefront had stayed off since that night. Jacob sat in the back office with the blinds drawn, the scent of bleach still clinging faintly to the walls. He hadn't reopened. No customers had knocked. No news vans had come. The world beyond the pet store carried on without so much as a whisper of what had happened. Jacob had no idea how he was going to pay to repair all the damage caused. He had checked every station, feed, and paper, but couldn't find a single mention of the incident. The police department's public log listed a false alarm at the taco shop and a closed medical call at the same address. There was no mention of fatalities or of any sort of follow-up, let alone missing persons reported. Every person who had succumbed to the insects had their deaths swept away, their disappearances left unexplained, with the families of the deceased left to deal with the consequences without the courtesy of an explanation. Jacob stopped trying to report it after the 3rd time he was transferred to a disconnected line. He slept in the back of the store now, curled beneath a fleece blanket on an unused shelving pad, surrounded by sealed vents. A week later, he discovered another package waiting on the step. There was no knock, and he never caught a glimpse of the delivery driver or the vehicle that carried him, and yet there it was. He found it just after dawn, a plain brown box with a printed label bearing the familiar green and white Cricket Farm logo. As before, the address matched the shop's. The sender's name was close, Sandridge Exotics, LLC. But something in the font was subtly wrong, too crisp and uniform, like a facsimile printed from memory. There was no signature or tracking slip. He brought the box inside and set it on the front counter. The place still smelled of melted plastic and scorched wire. On top of the package lay a white envelope. It had no stamp or postmark, just his name in block letters. Inside was a check made out to Jacob Ellery in the amount of $14,200, drawn from a bank he'd never heard of. The name of the issuing account had been left blank. Below the check, on a single typed sheet of paper, was a short message. Mr. Ellery, we regret the recent mishap regarding your shipment. A temporary routing malfunction caused certain experimental biological material to be misdirected. The matter has since been resolved. Your account has been credited, and your original order has been fulfilled. This will not happen again. Thank you for your discretion. There was no signature, contact information, or return address. Jacob stared at the note for a long time, then folded it and placed it back into the envelope. He turned to the box and examined the tape along the top. The weight was right for a cricket order, lighter than the earlier late-night shipment. There was a faint shifting sound when he tilted it, the dry scrape of tiny limbs against cardboard. He knew the sound. He'd heard it 1,000 times before, but now it made the hairs on his neck rise. He brought the box closer to his ear. From within, there was movement, a single measured shift, as though something inside had turned its attention toward him. Jacob set the box down and slowly backed away, never taking his eyes off it. The box shook violently just once, but that was all he needed to see. Jacob turned and ran, and never looked back. He had no idea what was in the box this time, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't crickets. Whatever was in the box, he wasn't sticking around to find out. That was Crickets by Beau Grissom, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood.
I've got goosebumps the size of beetles. Remind me never to trust anything that chirps in the dark.
Or anything smart enough to imitate you before it eats you.
Coming up next, a descent into a research station where the signal gets fuzzy, and the things watching you don't need eyes to see. When a vessel returns from an expedition through an unstable rift in reality, the team believes they've made first contact. But what came back isn't alone. It's not a warning, it's an invitation. This is The Rift by Samuel A. Kepler, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. Threshold Dynamics did not appear on any public registry. The company had no website, no press releases, and no shareholders, at least not in the conventional sense. It existed at the intersection of dark research grants, untraceable contracts, and deniable oversight. Nestled deep in the northern wilds of an unnamed region bordering 3 national parks, it was a ghost company moving with surgical precision through bureaucratic loopholes that left no trace behind. And it had been granted exactly what it wanted: isolation, silence, and the freedom to experiment. Dr. Arden Vale stood at the edge of the site's temporary scaffold platform, gazing out over a pine forest that rolled and dipped across the valley below like a sea of jagged black. Wind swept up from the ravine, cold and sharp, rattling the aluminum supports around her and tugging strands of hair from the braid knotted tightly against the base of her neck. Behind her, massive ceramic capacitors hummed low as they idled, each of them feeding into the buried latticework of the dimensional rift generator, her life's work, born from 17 years of math, theory, and funding from people who never asked what she was trying to reach. She preferred it that way. From the temporary comms tent, a voice crackled through her earpiece. We're 15 minutes out, Dr. Vale. The escort's nearly at checkpoint Delta. She touched her earpiece to respond, her voice clipped but clear. Copy. Bring them in slowly. Don't let the vehicles idle near the field. I don't want any more interference than we already have. Arden turned and stepped down the aluminum stairs, her boots landing on packed gravel lined with coil power cables and plastic sheeting. A thin layer of frost coated everything, despite the mild forecast. Temperature fluctuations like that had become common in the zone. The instruments called it an inverted thermal bloom, but she had other names for it, names she didn't say aloud. At the outer perimeter, just beyond the second electrified fence, a convoy of black SUVs crawled along the switchback trail, tires crunching the ground slowly. One vehicle bore a bright orange triangle on the hood, marking it as civilian. Inside sat Maxine Holt, hands gripping the wheel with the ease of someone used to navigating unpaved roads in uneven terrain. She'd been briefed in exactly the way Threshold Dynamics like to handle outsiders. Vague, authoritative, and with the promise of hazard pay if she asked no questions. She already had questions. The forest had changed since she'd passed through it last 2 years ago. It was subtle, at first. The color of the pines had dulled in places, and birds were few and far between. Branches sagged as if under unseen weight. Tree trunks closer to the project zone bore deep spiral cracks as though something had twisted them from within and left them to rot upright. Maxine stopped at the second checkpoint, where a man in a reinforced vest scanned her ID and made her wait until he checked with the command tent. He didn't smile. She didn't either. When the gates parted, she drove slowly up the gravel road toward the clearing where the core structure of Threshold's operations loomed over the forest floor in a tangled mess of scaffold, cable, and generators that never quite stopped vibrating. It looked more like preparation for war than science. Inside the main control tent, Arden met her with a nod but offered no handshake. "Ms. Holt, thank you for coming on short notice." Maxine surveyed the cluttered interior, maps pinned to corkboard, monitors showing oscillating energy readouts, and personnel walking with too much purpose for a research station. "I wasn't told what I'd be escorting." "You're not escorting anything," Arden replied, turning back toward the inner corridor of the tent. "You're here in case something gets out." Maxine followed her in silence, boots thudding softly against the reinforced flooring. "You planning for that?" she asked. More of a statement than a question. "I plan for everything," Arden replied, "but in this case the risk is theoretical." Maxine said nothing. She had the sense this woman had long ago stopped believing in theory. They passed into the observation dome, an open-sided tent ringed with high-powered scopes and field displays. At its center sat the core itself, encased in an obsidian black shell. Mounted above it was a rig of refractive sensors and Tesla coils, linked in a toroidal array that manipulated ambient energy. At Arden's signal, a technician keyed in the final sequence. "We're breaching in 10 minutes, Arden said. "What you're about to see will change everything about our understanding of spatial entanglement." Maxine didn't care about the science. She watched the forest. The trees were no longer swaying in the wind. In fact, the wind had stopped entirely. When the surge occurred, the air did not explode or ripple. Rather, it became still. So profoundly still that even breath felt intrusive. A shrill hum rose to the edge of hearing, and the obsidian shell began to open, unfolding itself. At first, nothing happened, but then the mist along the valley floor parted. Across the ravine, perhaps 3 miles distant, something enormous breached the tree line slowly and silently, with no visible force behind it. Maxine blinked, unsure whether her mind was reacting to the breach or if the thing before her was real. It was a head, human in shape and vaguely feminine, but scaled impossibly beyond comprehension, stone-like in appearance. Its crown emerged first, hair trailing in black tendrils like oil through water. Then its eyes, 2 cavernous hollows filled with pulsating red light, emerged through the fog and settled just above the horizon, tilted downward as though watching them. The forest beneath it didn't react. No trees snapped, no animals fled, but those who stood nearby found themselves frozen in place. Even Arden's voice wavered. "Mark the visual anomaly. Record all sensor data. No one is to attempt contact." But Maxine was already backing away. She wasn't even thinking of the pay anymore. Her instincts, honed over years of trekking through country too wild to care who lived or died in it, were screaming one unified message. Whatever had just been released had been waiting a long time. Behind her, Arden stood rooted, numbers flooding her mind, her mouth silently forming equations only she could follow. Far above and impossibly close, the giant's eyes glowed brighter and its gaze narrowed. Part 2. The head never moved. It remained perched above the forest, its immense form anchored in fog and stillness, as though balanced against the curvature of the world itself. The horizon bent around it, its dark hair continued to stream downward in strands, too straight to be wind-blown, trailing through the mist. But the feature that gripped everyone, no matter how trained, how analytical, how skeptical, was the glow of its eyes. Its twin crimson orbs did not radiate light as expected. Instead, they pulsed, striking the retina in a way that refused to integrate with depth perception. No one could agree on how far away the head was. Some said 5 miles, others claimed it was close enough to see pores in the skin. Dr. Arden Vale stood beneath the canopy of the makeshift command dome, her gaze locked through the mounted ocular lens of the forward scope. Around her, engineers ran diagnostics, logged data, and performed retinal recalibrations. Anything to feel as though they still controlled the situation. Arden knew they didn't. She didn't say it aloud, but the realization had already begun weaving through her thoughts. Visual coherence degrading past the 182nd mark, said Haru King, her lead instrumentation analyst. Observer fatigue increasing exponentially. We're seeing early signs of disorientation and word slippage. Arden blinked slowly and stepped back from the scope. Cycle out observers every 2 minutes. Keep logs of subjective reports as well as biometric telemetry. I want everything on record. Kim hesitated before nodding. Yes, Doctor. Beyond the field tent, the entity loomed unchanged. No one had seen it rise, and no one could say for sure whether it had emerged or had simply always been there, veiled until the breach pulled back the curtain. The lack of motion defied expectation more than any roar or earth-shaking step could have. Something that large should move. It should tower and tremble the ground with every breath. But this stillness, was a more profound violation. It was watching, and it did not need to move to reach you. By the second day of exposure, symptoms began appearing in clusters. Workers reported vivid dreams in which they were being pulled upward by unseen hands, slowly unspooled like yarn. One man became convinced he'd never existed before arriving at the site. Another tried to dig into the earth with his bare hands, claiming something below was whispering the equations Arden had recited during the breach. Sleep became difficult. Time became elastic. Maxine began checking her watch hourly, not to tell time, but to prove that it still existed. Roland Cass arrived on the third day, his unmarked transport sliding quietly through the checkpoint without fanfare. His demeanor remained cold but attentive, the kind of man who had seen everything he was supposed to believe was classified. After being briefed by 2 of Arden's liaisons, both of whom repeated nearly identical phrases without deviation, he requested to speak with the director herself. He found her not in the command tent, but seated alone near the observation ridge, with a field notebook open in her lap, eyes half-lidded as she stared toward the ridge where the being remained. Her pencil moved without pause, inviting attention as she sketched spirals and mirrored loops. You've seen it, I take it, he said by way of introduction. Arden did not look up, studied it. Roland moved beside her, keeping the being just out of his direct line of sight. Studied, but not explained. I'm not sure explanation is the point. Roland folded his arms. I've reviewed your chain of command reports. They're incomplete, contradictory in places. One report states the breach occurred at 0500, another lists it at 1300 hours. There's mention of a technician named Mallory who assisted with the calibration sequence, but no one on staff remembers her. His clearance file is empty. Arden smiled faintly without turning her head. We brought back more than expected. Roland frowned. We didn't bring anything back, Dr. Vale. We opened a tear in something we don't understand. And now half your crew is reporting neurological drift, and the other half can't remember who they are. She finally looked at him. Yet you're here. I go where the contract tells me. Do you feel it yet? I feel the unease of a man standing too close to a cliff, that's all. Arden returned to her notebook. It'll get closer. Roland walked away without responding, but the knot in his stomach remained. It tightened when he passed by the mess tent and saw a young assistant stirring coffee with his index finger, unaware that his hand was submerged in liquid several degrees below freezing. No one else noticed. No one wanted to. That night, a perimeter technician named Bradley Vire left for a standard loop check. He didn't return. His absence was noted by the quartermaster at 0117, though the time was later disputed. Logs showed he'd never checked out. Security footage revealed nothing. His cot remained untouched. Maxine was the first to raise alarm, having spoken with Bradley shortly before his patrol. She insisted he'd joked about the temperature and borrowed her scarf. Arden denied any breach. When pressed, she offered no explanation for the missing footage. It's not a breach, she said. It's a transference. What the hell's that mean? Maxine asked. It means Bradley's somewhere else now. Is he alive? Arden didn't answer. The next morning, the scarf was found hanging from a pine branch 15 feet above the ground, twisted into a knot that mirrored the pattern Arden had been sketching. Maxine stared at it for several seconds before finally speaking. I don't think the forest appreciates our presence. No one argued. By midday, communications began to break down. Satellite uplink failed. Power flickered in intervals that did not align with known patterns. The head remained motionless, yet its gaze seemed to deepen. At 1942, someone entered the north gate on foot. He was barefoot and pale, carried no tools, and had no visible injuries. His gait was fluid but unhurried. He didn't speak. When halted by armed personnel, he raised his arms and complied without resistance. His clothing was standard issue for site workers, dark thermals, worn boots, insulated vest, but his boots were gone. His name tag was missing. His ID badge had been found hours earlier, still clipped to a broken branch. Arden arrived as he was being questioned. Do you know who you are? She asked. The man blinked once and turned his head toward the ridge. I am the vessel, he said, voice calm, eyes glassy. It is asked to speak. What is it? Arden asked. You already know. Behind them, the glow intensified, and somewhere in the ridgeline of their minds, something stirred. The man closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they reflected red. Part 3. They didn't know what to call him at first. There's no identification left on his person, and the badge found earlier could not be reliably matched to his face, which now bore an expression of such vacant serenity that it seemed artificial. Arden referred to him only as the subject in her preliminary notes, but the others began calling him the vessel in lieu of his earlier comments, and the name stuck. He didn't object. In truth, he didn't speak much at all. When he did, however, the effect was immediate and unsettling. He uttered things he should not have known, lines from encrypted personnel files, locker combinations, fragments of conversation, spoke days earlier in confidence and behind closed tent flaps. At one point, He interrupted a diagnostic technician mid-report to inform her, without prompt, that her mother had died that morning thousands of miles away. The next satellite ping confirmed it. Most disturbing of all was the voice. It remained his, at least in timbre and volume, but there was a pressure behind it, a low-frequency vibration that made skin prickle and teeth ache. Observers reported headaches, nausea, and in one instance, temporary aphasia after extended proximity. Roland imposed a strict 5-minute exposure limit for any personnel assigned to monitor him. Arden ignored it. She sat across from the vessel in the far end of the medical tent, a notepad balanced on her knee, her eyes fixed on the gentle rise and fall of his chest. Electrodes trailed from his scalp to a bank of portable scanners, each one logging brain activity in a chaotic bloom of overlapping waves that defied explanation. Despite the impossibility of it, the data remained consistent. Wrong, but consistently so. "You're processing input in channels I can't map," she murmured. The vessel did not respond, but his eyes remained open and unblinking. They were deeply red around the irises, as though backlit by something watching from within. "You're communicating without speech," Arden continued. "I think you're already filtering us, choosing what to show." Still nothing. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "What is the purpose of your presence?" His lips parted. "To hold what you cannot." Arden nodded. "Containment." The vessel tilted his head slightly. "Understanding." "Of us?" "No. Of hunger." That evening, Roland isolated himself in the communications trailer and replayed the voice logs from his first interview with Arden. He listened for tone shifts, inflection changes, and inconsistencies. He played them twice, and a third time, comparing them with his memory. The problem wasn't that they were wrong. The problem was that the second and third playbacks differed from each other, subtly but unmistakably. He replayed the same clip again and again. Each time, the phrasing changed, only by a word or the placement of a pause, but it was enough. He opened the metadata. Time of recording? Not listed. File size? 0 kilobytes. He played it again. This time, Arden didn't speak at all. Roland slammed the laptop shut and pressed his palms into his eyes. When he opened them, the screen was blank and a face stared back, only it wasn't his. It was his daughter's. He staggered back, catching himself in the wall. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Then the image faded, returning to static. No trace remained. He left the trailer without speaking to anyone and returned to his quarters, where he found her again. His daughter, 9 years old, sitting on his bunk with knees drawn to her chest, looking just as she had the last time he saw her before illness took her. He stood in the doorway, unable to move or speak. "Daddy," she said, "I missed you." The next morning he filed no report. Instead, he returned to the field perimeters and walked the entire north sector twice, eyes never leaving the horizon. The head remained fixed in its place, and though it had not moved, Roland could no longer convince himself it had not noticed him. Maxine had stopped sleeping. It began with fragments, dreams of snowfields stained with ink, forests where the trees leaned in clusters, their branches hooked like fingers as if colluding. But the dreams became deeper, longer, and soon indistinguishable from waking. In one, she found herself running across the valley, arms outstretched, only to realize her limbs were comprised of bark and sinew. She felt her body rooting itself into the soil as her breath slowed and her thoughts became still water. When she woke, she vomited pine needles into the sink. By midweek, she tried to leave the compound entirely. She packed a light kit, strapped a rifle, and set out along the marked trail she'd helped map herself. An hour in, the path twisted back on itself. 2 hours later, she found her own boot prints heading in the opposite direction. When she looked up, she noticed the stars above were too bright and that they were in the wrong places. Orion had 2 belts. Cassiopeia curved downward like a hook. The forest had changed. The land now moved in loops. She returned, silent and pale. Arden did not question her. Arden, for her part, had been building something in the lower research tent. Something no one else had clearance to see. Using parts stripped from drone kits, memory rigs, and feedback isolation gear, she assembled a neural interface of her own design. No one approved it. She hadn't asked. She believed the entity desired contact, not with the body, but with the consciousness. She believed it was not hostile, only dispersed, too large to communicate via traditional channels, too alien to enter minds uninvited. The vessel, she theorized, was its outstretched finger, but a finger requiring a willing touch to complete the gesture. When she announced her intention to initiate contact, Roland objected immediately. "You don't know what it wants," he said. "You don't know what this thing is, and whatever's inside that man is using you." Arden didn't raise her voice. There's no difference between use and communion. Not anymore. If this is some messianic delusion, you need to pull back before you destroy what's left of your team. But Arden was already fitting the interface nodes to her temples, calibrating the relay with fingers trembling from lack of sleep. Maxine arrived without being summoned. She stood silently at the edge of the tent as Arden seated herself before the vessel, wires trailing from her scalp to his wrists. "You should know," Maxine said quietly. "It's been dreaming, too." Arden met her gaze. "That's what I'm counting on." The interface activated. The moment the circuit closed, Arden's vision narrowed. The world collapsed into a tunnel of shadow and red light, and her ears filled with a rushing sound. Images surged through her mind, not memories, but recognitions, as though something behind her own thoughts had begun flipping through her life without regard for sequence or meaning. She saw her childhood bedroom, lit by the green glow of an old digital clock. She saw her father's lab, cluttered and smelling of burnt ozone, and the expression on his face when he first realized something had gone wrong. She saw herself, younger and idealistic, delivering lectures to rooms of glassy-eyed bureaucrats who nodded without hearing a word. All of it shimmered, then inverted. Language flooded her thoughts, not in words, but in arrangements of possibility. Pattern after pattern, folding into one another. There was hunger there, yes, but also awe. The entity was not seeking destruction. It was seeking a way to be heard in a universe that had no instruments capable of detecting its voice. Arden opened her mouth. The vessel did the same. In unison, they spoke. "We are listening." Part 4. The trees began to spiral, not in dramatic whorls or grotesque contortions, but in gentle, nearly imperceptible curves that became evident only when viewed from a distance. Maxine noticed first, pacing the northeast ridge at sunrise, where pines tilted in a slow arc that followed the line of sight back toward the observation platform. What had once been a straight perimeter trail now veered and doubled, with saplings emerging in geometric clusters, 5-pointed arrays. Fibonacci spirals and curling helixes of bark and branch that defied natural growth patterns. The terrain felt unfamiliar, even where she had walked just days before. The earth sloped differently. Elevation rose where it once fell. Deer tracks moved in impossible loops, and frost coated the shadowed sides of trees regardless of the sun's direction. Even sound behaved strangely. Bird calls echoed from directions where no birds perched, and footsteps returned on delay, sometimes repeating as whispers. Maxine stopped walking and raised her compass. The needle spun slowly, then shuddered and fixed on north. 2 seconds later, it reversed. She frowned and pulled her phone from her vest pocket, accessing the offline satellite map she'd downloaded before entering the zone. The map showed a ridgeline she recognized, flanked by 3 rivers and a logging road that had long since been swallowed by undergrowth. She turned in place, aligning the terrain with the topography, but the land no longer matched. The rivers were gone. The ridgeline bent the wrong way. She lowered the phone and looked toward the valley. The head still loomed, motionless, vast, and unchanging, dominating every line of perspective. No matter how she turned, the entity's face followed. It had become the axis around which the world now revolved. When Maxine returned to camp, Arden was waiting. "You've seen it, haven't you?" the doctor asked, her voice calm but electric. Maxine hesitated. "The land's wrong." "It isn't wrong, it's reorganizing." Arden held up a sheet of paper. It was a scan of sensor data overlaid with topographic mapping, annotated with symbols Maxine didn't recognize, some scientific, others bordering on mystical. At the center was a waveform oscillating around a shifting fulcrum that expanded with each cycle. "It's building a framework," Arden continued. "Not with matter, but with thought. We're inside it now. Not physically, but perceptually." "You think that's a good thing?" Maxine asked, her voice flat. "I think it's inevitable," Arden replied. She turned and led Maxine toward the modified observation rig that had replaced the original containment core. The equipment had been altered beyond recognition. Screens now displayed real-time overlays of biological patterns interlaced with feedback from Arden's neural interface. One monitor synchronized with the vessel's respiration. Another displayed the rolling streams of code that read more like poetry than programming, looping in mirrored sentences that folded and refolded into themselves. Roland stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes sunken with exhaustion. "She's going to try it again," he said without preamble. "This time without limiters." Maxine didn't answer. She watched Arden adjust the final relay. "She thinks it wants to merge," Roland added. Arden glanced over her shoulder. "Not merge. Harmonize. You're thinking in binary terms. This isn't about control." "What is it about, then?" Arden's voice softened. "It wants to know, and to be known." The vessel sat in a high-backed chair, silent, wires running from his skull to the modified relay system. His skin was pale, his lips parted in a breathless whisper. His eyes, still lit from within by a dull red glow, tracked Arden's movements with the patience of a being that understood time differently. He hadn't slept. No one knew if he needed to. Arden fitted the final nodes to her temples and sat across from him. "Can't understand something like this by staying outside of it," she said. "You have to allow it to access your structure." Roland took a step forward. "You're not prepared for this. You don't know what it'll do to your mind." "I've spent my life preparing," she replied. "It's not doing anything. It's just existing. We're the ones contorting to understand." "That's the problem," Roland snapped. "It isn't speaking our language. It's writing its own inside you." Arden closed her eyes and activated the interface. Immediately, the tense lights dimmed, and the hum of the generators shifted pitch. The relay's primary coil began to glow faintly, and screens blinked into static before reorganizing themselves into recursive geometric shapes. The vessel exhaled slowly. Arden inhaled once, then fell still. Maxine moved to intervene, but Roland held up a hand. "Not yet." What followed was not a seizure, though it resembled one. Arden's fingers twitched, her lips trembled, and her eyes rolled beneath her lids. Data streamed from the interface in increasingly erratic waves, spikes, troughs, and errant loops that broke the machine's calibration models. Her brain was rewriting itself faster than the system could log. Suddenly, Arden sat upright. Her eyes were open, but they no longer focused. Her voice came out dual-toned, as if layered over itself. "Structure acknowledged," she said. "Barriers eroding." She turned her head toward Roland. "You are incomplete." Maxine stepped forward. "Arden, you need to stop." "I am not Arden," the voice replied. "She remains, but it is assimilating." Roland pulled his sidearm from his belt and approached slowly. "You said it was communion, not possession." "There is no possession, only architecture." The vessel stood in unison with Arden, mirroring her posture. Roland raised the weapon. "If you've taken her from us, I swear to God." "You are swearing to no one," the voice said gently. Roland fired. The bullet stopped midair, hovering between them. Then it fell. Roland stumbled backward, his hand trembling. His vision blurred, and the air around him fractured. He felt memory leak through his awareness, disjointed images of childhood days that never occurred, glimpses of events still to come, people he had never met speaking his name in languages he'd never learned. Maxine caught him as he collapsed to one knee. "Stay with me," she whispered, gripping his shoulders. But Roland could no longer speak. He opened his mouth and only fragments emerged. Arden stepped forward. "This was not conquest," she said. "It was an invitation." She reached toward Maxine. "You are the last door." Maxine backed away. "No," she said. "You were always going to say that," the voice replied. "But I had to ask." The vessel and Arden turned in unison and walked toward the edge of the platform. Beyond them, the forest had begun to shimmer. Trees bled into the sky. The clouds moved in reverse. The head above the valley glowed brighter, and for the first time, something changed. Its lips parted. Inside the opening, there were no teeth, only a spiraling corridor of mirrors, each surface reflecting a different version of the world. Maxine stood frozen as Arden's form shimmered. Her edges softened, then restructured. For a brief moment, she seemed made of script, rows of curling characters that rotated in sequence before folding inward, vanishing in a burst of impossible geometry. The vessel followed. Then there was silence. The forest settled. The equipment powered down. Roland sat curled on the ground, muttering phrases in a language that bent time around sound. Maxine stepped to the platform edge and looked out. The head still loomed. Its gaze remained fixed, but it no longer needed to reach. It had become the space, and they had helped it remember the shape of the door through which it had entered. The forest was quiet again. The survey drone swept low across the valley, transmitting heat signatures to a secure uplink that no longer existed. Its onboard camera recorded pine canopy, scrub, and fog. Nothing unusual. The field where the Threshold Dynamics compound had once stood was overgrown, the scaffold removed, the generators gone. No satellite records marked the facility. No roads remained visible from above. The drone's logs would later be reviewed by an automated system tasked with monitoring atmospheric radiation in disused government zones. It flagged no anomalies. It also failed to record the moment the drone's reflection appeared in the air 5 meters above its own body, lagging half a second behind. Official records stated that the site had been decommissioned following the withdrawal of funding. No reason was listed. No incident report filed. FOIA requests returned with redacted blocks and template responses citing expired clearances. Attempts to trace Threshold Dynamics led to disconnected phone numbers, expired domains, and offshore holding companies that folded within weeks of inquiry. The name, Arden Vale, appeared briefly in one academic journal. An article on dimensional topology later pulled for formatting inconsistencies. The author profile linked to no institution. The portrait was blank. And yet, the land remembered. A pair of hikers from an outlying township wandered into the valley late in October, following a trail that didn't appear on modern maps. Along it, they found no buildings or roads. At the river's edge, they watched curiously as water ran uphill briefly before resuming its natural course. They did not return the way they came. One claimed they had been followed by something just out of sight. The other refused to speak about the trip entirely. When prompted, she insisted she had never gone hiking in that area, despite photographic evidence to the contrary. Elsewhere, a retired contractor in Michigan suffered a stroke during breakfast. He awoke 2 days later. He spoke a phrase repeatedly to his daughter before slipping into a coma. He said, "The door was made of mirrors and I couldn't find the frame." No one knew what he meant. In the weeks that followed the event, Maxine remained off-grid. She traveled west by train, avoiding digital records, changing aliases, and moved through towns as though haunted by something she could neither name nor explain. At night, she dreamed of forests she had never explored, mouth-like valleys and colossal visages rising against the sky. She kept a journal, though the ink often faded by morning. Once she found pages she hadn't written, filled with curved symbols that vaguely resembled letters. She burned them all. Some nights she woke, convinced she was no longer the sole occupant of her body. She never spoke to Roland again. His fate was uncertain. Witnesses claimed he boarded a cargo plane under a false name 2 days after the final incident. The flight's manifest was later lost. No one at the receiving airport remembered seeing him disembark. His apartment in Maryland remained untouched. Rent payments continued for 4 months and then stopped. The landlord entered the unit to find a message scrawled hastily on the bedroom ceiling with what appeared to be a permanent marker. It read, "I remember things that haven't happened yet. I don't want to." The landlord did not call the police. He simply painted over the message and rented the apartment to someone else. The new tenant complained of vivid dreams and insomnia, but chose not to move out. In Washington, a clerk in the Geological Survey Department flagged a series of magnetic anomalies centered on a cluster of remote wilderness regions, one of them which included the former breach site. When she presented the findings to her supervisor, she was told to shelve the report. 3 days later, her system credentials were revoked. When she protested, she was informed she had never been employed there. She still receives voicemail messages with only static and distant whispering. She no longer answers her phone. In the heart of the valley, the air remains dense in ways no barometer can measure. On mornings when the fog rolls in from the east, shapes appear for seconds at a time. Massive, slow-moving silhouettes with curves too perfect to be natural. Photographers sometimes capture them by accident. Most delete the images, convinced they've glitched the sensor. And yet, once in a while, one photograph surfaces, passed around forums, dissected, dismissed as a hoax, and re-edited into artwork. But those who spend too long staring into the grainy outline, especially if they invert the contrast, soon begin to dream of faces with stone-like skin and unblinking eyes. The image always finds its way back to obscurity. The being itself no longer appears in full, not all at once, but traces remain. Distorted, inaccurate reflections ripple in puddles near the valley floor. Trees lean in gentle curves. The sky folds subtly where the head once appeared, like fabric pressed too long against a sharp edge. People feel watched in places where no one is present. Children sometimes wake from sleep, in tears, claiming they heard a woman's voice reciting their name. On the winter solstice, a freelance surveyor crossing through the valley alone reported hearing the word home repeated in his own voice, though he hadn't spoken. He continued walking, but eventually stopped when his shadow split in two and then rejoined, the light no longer reflecting it properly afterward. Later, when interviewed by a forest ranger, he claimed he saw something that wasn't there and never was, but always would be. The ranger filed no report. That section of the forest was already listed as restricted. And on one fog-choked morning, a boy from a nearby township strayed from a family hiking path and wandered too close to the tree line. His mother found him standing still, eyes fixed on nothing. "What are you looking at?" she asked. The boy tilted his head. "I think it sees us." She followed his gaze, but there was only mist. She turned to lead him away. Behind them, in the distance, faint and far too large to be real, a silhouette emerged, vague and nearly translucent. Its eyes opened, and a voice came as if on the wind from nowhere and everywhere, all at once. "I see you." That was The Rift by Samuel A. Kepler, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry.
Every experiment's got a margin of error. That one, off the charts.
They went looking for an answer. What they found was a question that stares back.
If tonight's journey through cursed wires, clicking insects, vanishing towns, and voices in the dark left you craving more, you're in luck. There's plenty waiting for you in the patrons area. Extended ad-free episodes with exclusive horrors you won't find anywhere else.
It's just $7.99 a month or less if you pledge for the year, and you'll gain access to every story, every scream without a single interruption. You'll be helping indie horror thrive and making sure these strange signals keep coming through.
To join, just visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click the Patrons tab, or head directly to chillingtalesfordarknights.com to become a member. There are more stories waiting, if you're brave enough to press play.
From all of us here at Chilling Entertainment, thank you for keeping the darkness lit.
If tonight's episode taught us anything, it's that not everything delivered is meant to be opened. Whether it's an unlabeled crate crawling with things best left undescribed, a town not found on any map, or a signal from the other side of reason. Once you accept delivery, you might not like what comes with it.
Because some things don't knock, they're invited. A wire hums through the mountains, a rift waits to be crossed, a voice rises in the dark, calling you from behind your own eyes. You didn't order it, but it knows your name.
Be sure to subscribe to our parent channel, Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on YouTube, and don't forget to ring that bell so you never miss the next twisted transmission.
And if that isn't quite enough to keep the shadows fed, stop by Otis Jiry's Tales from Duskwood for more eerie encounters and voices from the deep. You'll find it on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and any place that still welcomes strange company. There's an entire season's worth of tales waiting for you.
We'd also love to hear from you. Find us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, and tell us which story crept under your skin tonight. Was it the mountain wire, the hungry chirping, the fractured town, or the thing that thinks with someone else's lobe?
And let's not forget to thank the brilliant authors who guided us through tonight's maze of mirrors and echoes. Without their courage to imagine, we'd all still be safely asleep.
But sleep is for the untroubled, and none of us are anymore. So the next time something arrives with no cinder, a voice calls from a place you forgot, or a town appears where none should be,
remember, not all gifts are given. Some are returned.
Sleep well, listeners.
If you can.
Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's OTIS@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.